Welcome to our special second Dispatch podcast of the week. I'm your host, Sarah Isger, joined by Steve Hayes and our own Tom Jocelyn, who writes our Vital Interest newsletter about foreign policy. This podcast is brought to you by The Dispatch. Visit thedispatch.com to see our full slate of newsletters and podcasts, and make sure to subscribe to this podcast so you never miss an episode. Today we'll talk China, and Tom will break down what they mean by discourse power, the Afghanistan peace deal, what a Biden administration might mean in our foreign policy. And we have a special appearance by my cat at some point, and some discussion about James Bond versus Jack Ryan. Let's dive right in. Today, we have, along with Steve Hayes, of course, special guest Tom Jocelyn, who writes the Vital Interest newsletter for The Dispatch. Tom, we're pumped to have you with us today because I don't feel like you get enough attention from all of us. You're writing this incredible newsletter. It's long and detailed. I learn stuff from it every single time I read it. I have to crunch through it. I have to concentrate, and it's good. It makes my brain, scratches it in new places. How did you get here? Where did you come from?
Well, appreciate that. I appreciate the praise for the newsletter. I tried to work on these complex issues and hopefully don't make you scratch your brain too hard, but I definitely am trying to challenge people to sort of understand what's going on. And I'm spending a lot of time reading through source material to try and distill that for people to figure out, sort of how these complex issues maybe affect them. I've known Steve since 2003. I was a nerd running these very large research projects for an economic consulting firm.
To be clear, Tom remains a nerd.
I am still a nerd. I'm proudly a nerd. That's true. And I started emailing Steve about some of his writings and some of the stuff he was working on and sending him these detailed research memos out of the blue. And he was wondering basically what the heck was going on and why this random person in New York was sending him stuff. And so we started talking, and then he got me writing for the Weekly Standard, and I sort of took off from there. Basically, I started off in doing counterterrorism research. I became obsessed with Al-Qaeda and jihadism after 9/11. And basically put my research brain, which I was using on economics and related projects, onto this, and have been obsessed with it ever since. And sort of built my own independent career as sort of an entrepreneurial endeavor doing this, and have a long sort of history now in doing it. I was at one point, and I hope nobody will hold this against me, but at one point I was the chief counterterrorism advisor for Rudy Giuliani in the 2008 presidential campaign. That I've got a lot of stories from that campaign, which were it was quite bizarre. But in any event, the world's only gotten crazier politically. But basically, as everything else is, nuts in the world is crazy, I try and keep focused on America's enemies, and that's the point of Vital Interest. I've sort of used it to branch out from the prolific terrorism research and writing analysis I've done, and the consulting I've done for the U.S. government and advisory work, and try and get into other areas, including on China and Russia and various other issues.
So let me expand on that story a little bit, because I think I love the story of how Tom and I met. So I was doing a ton of reporting in the lead up to the Iraq War, and then went over for 3 different times to cover the war over there. And as I was particularly focused on Saddam Hussein and his long support of terrorism, any and all terrorism, including Al-Qaeda and other jihadists. And I would write these pieces based on talking to intel officials and others. And then I would get an email from Tom, basically a memo that would say, hey, that's really interesting. I liked what you wrote there. You should look at this. And then I would go look at this. And invariably, it was more interesting than what I'd just written. And then I'd go and write about that. And then I'd get another email, and he'd say, you should now look at this. And I went and researched that and asked my intel sources about that. And Tom just knew all of this. So at one point, I just finally said, really, you should, look, I love sounding smarter than I am because I'm using your material, but I really would prefer it if you would write this stuff for the Weekly Standard. So he started writing for us, and we collaborated on a number of projects and articles, longer articles.
I was doing that, by the way, as I was still working in the economic consulting world. And that was a little bit awkward when I'd have high-priced lawyers email me and say, hey, is this you? I mean, it's the same name, same spelling. That's not exactly a common name. So they would say, what are you doing writing for the Weekly Standard while you're running my, $200 million research project,
Well, my favorite moment of all of our collaborations came when I forget what the actual story we were working on was. It was some retrospective on the Iraq War and something that we were learning about Saddam. And we were waiting. I'd tried desperately to get an advance copy of a Bob Woodward book. I think it might have been Bush at War. It was the one in the middle of the Bush administration.
I think it was George Tenet's memoir, right? It was actually George.
Could have been that. Tom, if that's what Tom says, just trust Tom on this. So it was coming out as books do on a Tuesday.
Yeah, I took my lunch break and walked down and got it at Barnes & Noble. Yeah.
Tom grabbed it. Mm-hmm. He can probably tell you what he had for lunch. Mm-hmm. He grabbed it, and I called him after lunch, and we were looking for 3 or 4 specific things. What did Tenet say about this particular memo, or what how was this described? And I asked him a random question. This is God's honest truth. Just series of random questions, and in response to one of the questions, he said something like, "Oh, that's at the bottom of page 253." I'm like, "What are you? How would you even know that? Like the book literally hasn't been on sale for more than 2 hours at this point." And he'd read the entire book, and he knew, like, his mind just can catalog stuff like that, which is, as you can imagine, is tremendously useful when you do the kind of things that Tom does. So we would have these elaborate conversations about, meetings that took place between jihadists in different times. And Tom would remember the meeting, the date, the time, if it was available, who else was there, how they got there. And this all lives in his brain, which is pretty remarkable.
Well, I'm glad he's writing for us. I mean, this sounds like someone you don't want, on any other side.
Last point I will make, and Tom, I hope you're not blushing, but last point, I had a conversation not long ago with somebody I'll just describe as a very, very senior U.S. government official who deals in these matters and has a really cool office. And this person said, the single best analyst anywhere on issues of, on the 9/11 wars, on jihad, on these kind of national security issues is Tom Joslin. And that included everybody in that particular building. So that was really saying something.
Well, Tom, let's dive in. Let's
now I have to live up to, this grandiose introduction here. Yeah. So no pressure or anything,
We expect you to footnote the whole pod. Yeah. Let's start really high level. You talked, when you talked about how you think about your newsletter, about the safety and security of this country. Are we safer than we were on January 20th, 2017?
Probably not. I mean, the world is, it's the problem is looking at the world now. I mean, it's sort of a cliche thing to say, and you hear these security officials say it, but it is much more complex in terms of the threat streams that the intelligence bureaucracy, the politicians and others have to think about and manage. And really bureaucrats are thinking about. The politicians aren't really doing much thinking about this stuff these days, as far as I could tell. But it is a much more complex world than it is. I mean, if you go back to 9/11, just let's go from there to now. On 9/11, of course, the world was Americans were shaken by those events. We sort of had this idea that we were secure at home here in the U.S. There hadn't been an attack on American soil like that, really, I guess, since, obviously Pearl Harbor, but even before that, the War of 1812. And sort of the whole, world came crashing down on us on that day. And we realized that this is a much more complex, web of threats out there that we have to worry about. Since that time, that was sort of the jihadist threat or the Al-Qaeda threat. Since that time, not only has the threat of jihadism changed and morphed and evolved, but now you have these other overlying threats from China and Russia and other actors that you have to deal with. And on top of that, you have the cyber threats. You have, just a whole range of issues now you have to deal with that really weren't present on 9/11. So now you have to look at the world in a very different way and think about and try and manage and figure out how you're going to go about protecting Americans from all these different bad actors.
Well, in your newsletter this week, which I thought was particularly perfect, maybe
Again,
I think it was my favorite.
Let's not build up too much here. Okay, it's something I had to learn this. I'm terrible at sales or any kind of things like that, right? But there's something like setting a lower bar and then sort of clearing the lower bar,
Fair.
right? Let's not set the bar too higher. But yeah,
I thought the newsletter was really average this week, Tom.
There we go.
Maybe
That's
below
good.
average.
There we go. That's better.
That's
now.
not actually what I said in my
better.
email to you, but
that's good. No, we'll go
No,
average.
I mean,
Average is good. It's like the George Costanza line. It's C-. Not falling behind, not getting ahead. Just sort of that's where you want to aim.
I think it might have been your best. Okay. Anyway, you're talking about China in it, and you're talking about a term, discourse power. And I think this explains so much about foreign policy today, and even looking back, foreign policy pre us really engaging with China. It's the translation of a Chinese term. I'm wondering if you can tell us more about the term, how it applies today, and sort of how we sit in this war over discourse power in some ways with China. Yeah,
it's an interesting thing that I learned from reading the testimony and the work of true experts on China, including there was this commission. They brought up during this commission hearing. I forget the actual name. Now I'm letting myself down here. I'm forgetting the actual exact name of the commission. But there was a hearing in April where several experts testified about this issue, discourse power. And of course, I was well aware of it before that. And basically, it goes back to this idea the Chinese essentially think that the rules of the world were established before they had power, before their rise to power. The Chinese Communist Party was sort of second tier or third tier power when this rules of the game were set. And now that they've come into their own sort of preeminence, now that they've gained material power and have gained economic power, military power, and otherwise, they think that they should also have what's known as discourse power. And basically, the idea is that they not only get to help set the rules of the game, sort of international law, how the rules and regulations everybody abides by, but also be able to control the narrative and basically set the narrative. And what they say is that the U.S. and its allies in the West have been able to set the narrative for too long. Basically, what Americans say, that becomes how people view things or how they frame things. We want to be able to do that. We want to be able to tell people how to think about the world and the issues that involve us and others. And so this discourse power goes beyond, it's sort of a blunt sort of power politics. They think that just by virtue of the fact they have this material power now, they should be able to also have discourse power. But it goes beyond the idea of facts, right? They're not saying that, okay, let's let facts or logic lead the way, as Steve likes to talk about facts and logic. I'm sure you've heard his spiel on that a number of times, and in reporting and analysis. It's not about facts and logic for them. It's about purely the fact that they are who they are. They're not the small kid on the block anymore. They're a bigger kid. They should be able to sort of push people around and tell them how to think about the world. And that's sort of how their diplomats are behaving. They call them wolf warriors, which is after this pair of action movies that came out of China. They're sort of like the crude version of the 80s action flicks in America. It's sort of, they have their version of Rambo, their version of, one of Arnold Schwarzenegger's characters who hunts down all these villains who inevitably they're answering to an American known as Big Daddy. And right now for them, Big Daddy is Mike Pompeo, the Secretary of State. That's sort of how the wolf warriors, the diplomats for the Chinese Communist Party view it. And they're gunning for him and they're gunning for President Trump and they're gunning for Americans in this back and forth. And sort of the point of my newsletter was, well, that's fine. America has to stand up for itself in this diplomatic fight, but the facts are going to matter, or they should matter. And so whatever our diplomats are saying should be grounded in sort of the reality and the real facts. It can't just come down to this idea of discourse power.
Steve?
Yeah, one of the big things that we've been discussing in this context, particularly with respect to China, is this great power competition, the role of international institutions, and obviously there's been a lot of focus on the WHO, which I think by any objective measure has played a bad role at the beginning of this outbreak, at the beginning of the pandemic. And there have been, I think, serious questions raised about Dr. Tedros, its leader, the role he's played, why he bends the knee to China in the way that he does. And you had the president, of course, suggest that we were going to suspend our funding and maybe withdraw from the WHO. My question to you is a simple one. Are we better fighting inside these international institutions to push against China and to try to help control those institutions and use them to advance our interests? Or is the president right? Should we, whether it's the WHO or even the UN, some of the other, are we better off just saying these institutions are so broken we should bail?
Well, it's a complex question. I mean, two things. One, China's relationship with the WHO and its leadership early on is a good example, actually, of discourse power, because the idea was that China would say something to WHO and they'd repeat it, right? Instead of actually just thinking about it and figuring out whether or not it's true or not.
Yeah.
So that sort of speaks to the nature of the problem. The second thing is, what I did a previous newsletter sort of critiquing the Trump administration, saying, look, you've got a point. The president has a point. Secretary Pompeo has a point that these international institutions are problematic. They need to be reformed or abandoned by the U.S. But you have to replace them with something. You have to do something in their stead. You can't just say, hey, the WHO stinks. I'm taking my ball and going home. The U.S. with the World Health Organization has been the number one donor to the World Health Organization for years. And had an empty seat on the board of the World Health Organization from 2018 onward. And so, it doesn't make any sense. It seems to me that the American government's behavior when it came to WHO was sort of the worst of all worlds. We sort of don't trust it or critical of it, but by the same time, we're the number one donor to it, and we're not going to actually exercise the influence that those donor dollars should grant us within the WHO. So we don't even fill I think there were like 33 or 34 board seats at WHO. America was the only seat that was empty, right?
Ours was empty. Yes.
Empty. Every other seat was filled, including by obscure countries I never even heard of in Africa and elsewhere, right? They had their seats filled and we didn't. The U.S. didn't, right? So this doesn't make any sense. I mean, if you're going to criticize WHO and you're going to say, look, this isn't the way we need to organize ourselves internationally, fine. I agree. We need reform, but you need to do something to replace that. You need to actually exercise the influence you have or do something new, right? You have to then actually create something new. And the point is that it's very easy. It's very easy for me. It's very easy for any of us to criticize these organizations and say, wag our finger at them. The difficult question is, well, what do you do instead? And the point is that I don't think there's really a serious conversation about that. And it's not just with the WHO, it's also with the Human Rights Council or Commission at the UN, which became the sort of cesspool. It's with other sort of places on the international stage where, look, China is looking to carve out these organizations from within. That's part of the discourse powers. They want to be able to sort of marionette these organizations with their new growing confidence. But the U.S. has to answer that either by figuring out a way to counter Chinese influence effectively in these organizations or build something new. And I don't think there's a real robust conversation on any of that.
So looking ahead, the president has been pretty, actually, I guess he's been a little all over the place on China in the last few weeks.
I call it scrambled eggs. I call it scrambled eggs. It's the scrambled eggs view of foreign policy. Yeah, it's criticizing on the one hand, and on the other hand, sort of repeating WHO sort of level of praise for Xi and others in the Chinese party.
But there's no question it's become a focus point. And where we go from here is a focus point. So today, for instance, the chief Chinese envoy, Lighthizer, the Treasury Secretary Mnuchin, promised to, quote, create a favorable atmosphere and conditions for implementing phase one of the trade agreement signed in January. At the same time, the president is talking about putting pressure on some of these pension funds, the Thrift Savings Plan, which has $50 billion in an international fund, to exclude Chinese-based stocks and companies, to exert more economic pressure in the midst of everything that's going on. As you look ahead to America's options of putting pressure on China, or even, I think some would say, punishing China for what we're all experiencing now because of the coronavirus, what are the reasonable options? What are the unreasonable options? If you were advising the president, what would you tell him today?
Well, I mean, look, I don't know what you could tell the president today on these issues. He has his own sort of peculiar sort of understanding of these things. And look, I think President Trump has been more critical or skeptical of the Chinese at times than some of his predecessors have been. I think that's warranted, quite frankly. How he articulates that and views it, however, often leaves much to be desired. And I'd like to take a step back for 1 second, because beyond what you're seeing here, I mean, this all started percolating across the U.S. government before President Trump was even elected. There was this idea great power competition was returning to the fold and was sort of going to be the central focal point for the U.S. government. And that sort of concept bubbled up at both the Defense Department, state, and elsewhere and throughout the U.S. government, that basically the U.S. had not been paying enough attention to China or others, Russia and others, and that basically we need to reorient our foreign policy toward that. And you can even see that in what President Obama was saying when he talked years ago about a pivot to Asia, right? That was playing off the same idea. Now, in the newsletter, I've explained how that idea also there's a lot of truth to it. There's also this notion, however, that we were overinvested in the 9/11 wars and we can take our eye off the fight against jihadism now because we have to worry about China and Russia. And what I would say is that's self-serving for the Defense Department that doesn't want to really be in these wars, and for others that basically the pivot away from the 9/11 wars has already happened. Most people don't even realize that about 20,000 troops are fighting in Iraq, Syria, and Afghanistan. Indo-Pacific Command, which is responsible for the Asian theater, it's a combatant command, has more than 4 times the personnel of any other combatant command, including CENTCOM, which is overseeing the fight against the jihadists. So these are the tectonic plates that are shifting here on this whole thing, this whole idea that we need to shift to great power competition. There's a lot of truth to it. There's also some misguided or misunderstanding involved in it. Now, on top of that, you get to the economic issues you're talking about, because that's an integral part of great power competition. And the point here is that there's really no consensus at all about what America's policy should be in terms of economics going forward. And even within your question, Sarah, there are actually several different issues even baked in there. One of them is the trade deal, right? Which I wrote about at the Vital Interest newsletter. The trade deal was basically, again, was the Trump administration's, President Trump and his advisors' attempt to sort of recalibrate the trade relationship between China and the U.S. And a couple of things about that. One, I don't know if she'd be happy with me saying this, but my sister is about to move across country. And she started to contract for a new house that she wants to build with her husband. And they got delayed in selling their house now on the East Coast. And so they basically couldn't buy this new house or start construction right away. And the developer said to her when she came back several months later, about a year later, or several months anyway, said, well, the cost of construction now is $60,000 higher. This is what he said to my sister. And my sister said, well, wait a minute, why? And he said, well, Trump's tariffs, because the price for the sort of the raw materials we need are now skyrocketed because of the tariffs. And even if you want to put aside that anecdote, that's the truth of the matter, is that these tariffs were used as a blunt instrument to basically force China to the negotiating table and to recalibrate the relationship on trade. However, the tariffs don't work the way President Trump and his advisors say they work. A lot of times the costs are borne by Americans, including if my sister goes forward with that house, by my sister and her husband, right? But also on washers and dryers and other things. You can see the real material costs of these things have gone up over time. So the question is, should we recalibrate the economic relationship with China? I say yes, we need to have that conversation. It's an enormously complicated issue. And the point is that the crude sort of tactics have been used so far by President Trump and his advisors. They've gotten this trade deal with China after, a trade war broke out. A lot of that cost of that are actually being borne by Americans, not by others. And the question is, when you go forward here, you're talking about how do we recalibrate that relationship? The trade deal, as I wrote at Vital Interest, is, I think, good in terms of China admits bad behavior, essentially, in terms of intellectual property rights, stealing, these nefarious joint venture schemes they have, other sort of issues. However, it's very short on enforcement and verification mechanisms. And as a former economist who used to read a lot of contracts, when I don't see the language that says, if you don't do this, then the penalty is this. When I don't see that language, and by the way, Steve, that language is not in the Taliban deal with the U.S. either. We'll get to that.
You anticipated my
right.
coming transition.
Yeah, right. But the point is that this is a very long-winded way of answering your question, Sarah. But the idea is that essentially, if you don't get down to the specifics, you don't let the nerds like me into the room to figure out what this actually is going to mean, right? Then what are you exactly doing? And I think I don't really have the answer right now. I don't know where this is all going to go from here. I mean, there's obviously a lot of pressure to decouple, to sort of change our, the supply chain management of the American companies need to get away from, Chinese source products. I think a lot of that's true. I think a lot of that's accurate. But how do you actually go about doing that without causing massive economic damage in the U.S.? Nobody solved that. Nobody has.
I mean, I think, and I've talked about this before, but I think there's the point you're making there is really an important one, and it has a lot to do with the very unique way that the Trump administration runs. If you go back and you think about how policy decisions have been made going back, decades, these things are policy workshopped in the agencies by the policy analysts, by the specialists. They sort of build their way up to the interagency. They get included in speeches, and then their policy, and the president makes a decision. This was, the important role of the speechwriters in particular was laid out, I thought, very well in Peggy Noonan's book, What I Saw at the Revolution, where she talked about how they were essentially the arbiters of what became policy, because if they could get the president to say it, it became policy. So they were, in some ways, the key deciders, or played a key role in that. With the Trump administration, that process has almost been flipped on its head. Because the president goes out, people have sort of general senses directionally of where he wants to be on some of these issues. I mean, Tom, you alluded to that. We know that he wants to be tough on China. We don't know exactly what that's going to look like, but we know that he wants to be tough on China. So the president goes out and says something, often in his ad hoc fashion, and immediately there's this scramble to determine what the policy implications are from what the president has said. And then you have all of these policy folks putting together something that resembles a policy to try to make sense of this. And I think that's the difficult position that Lighthizer and others are in. I mean, I certainly don't agree with them on their broad trade outlook. I'm much more of a free trader than I think anybody over there is. But that's a challenge for them if they are sort of doing it, retrofitting policy to the president's public rhetoric.
Steve, can I actually jump in to ask you a quick question on what Tom just said about supply chain issues? We're at a unique point where Americans, I think, are more aware of supply chain issues than ever before. Yeah. Do you think that the American public is ready in exchange for having less dependence on Chinese-based supply chain operations to take some of that domestically, even if there's some cost?
Such a good question.
Cost, cost meaning literal economic cost, but
pay.
Also
out of your checking account. Yeah.
Or it may be less convenient, or who knows?
Yeah, so it's a very good question. I don't know that we know the answer to that, but it's certainly the case that there's more attention focused on the rather unsexy but absolutely crucial issues of the supply chain now than any time in recent history, at least in terms of the public's attention on that. And if you look, there's polling on this that suggests Americans are willing to make those kind of sacrifices. The obvious question now, as I think we head into what probably will be remembered as a depression, is whether we even have that choice. Like, we don't have that choice. I mean, I think we for national security reasons, it makes a lot of sense to do the kinds of things that we can to make ourselves less dependent on China in particular sectors. I would say in the medical sector for sure, to some extent in parts for crucial national security interests and infrastructure programs. But I'm not sure we're going to have the freedom really to opt to pay more if we don't have, if you've got 33 million Americans who are out of work, people having trouble eating, a disrupted food supply chain here in the United States. I think there's a lot of talk about doing this in the abstract. I think it will be hard actually to put it in practice while we're under such great economic pressure here at home.
Tom?
I mean, basically the way I put it is, given, I've spent, before I started writing Vital Interest, the newsletter, I spent several years reading up on China and the Chinese Communist Party, as Steve knows. It's part of the reason why I felt confident to start writing this. And I'm willing to pay more personally, based on everything I know now. I'm willing to basically try and decouple, certainly in key areas, as much as possible. But I think Steve's exactly right. I mean, I don't know how that's going to translate to the broader economy, and with the broader population and the double-edged sword that is, where you have working class families who then have to pay more, at the grocery store or at Walmart for sort of, day-to-day essentials. And I think that, it's easy for somebody like me to slough off that increase in cost, but I don't think it's easy for somebody who's a blue collar, family who's working to get by and scrounge to get food on the table. It's not so easy for them. So I don't have the answers for that, but I know, based on my own understanding of the Chinese Communist Party, I think that a lot of America's policymaking was sort of naive about what was happening there, and thought that, I wrote this in one of the first issues of the newsletter, thought that basically economic liberalization was both necessary and sufficient to bring about political liberalization within China. And the truth of the matter is, it may be necessary, but it's certainly not sufficient, right? Yeah, exactly. And that's what we've seen now over the past 40 years. So we can't operate under those rules anymore. We have to have a clear-eyed view of what the Chinese Communist Party is doing, from their wolf warriors to on down, and the whole gambit of challenges they pose. And that's a whole complex set of issues in terms of how America should respond to it without making the situation worse, but also not sort of being willfully blind to what they're doing.
Steve, do you want to take us to Iran or Afghanistan?
Let's do it.
I'm very torn.
Yeah, no, this is great. I mean, I think let's take advantage of the transition that Tom teed up about contracts and language, and actually how you compel nations to act in certain ways, and go to Afghanistan and talk about the peace deal, or the exit deal, the
withdrawal deal.
Talk about. Yeah. So, I mean, Tom, obviously, very few people in the country have covered Afghanistan as closely as you and Bill Roggio have at Long War Journal, and also for us. And let me just ask you, is there anything that we're seeing in the 2 months? It's been a little over 2 months since the deal was signed. Is there anything that we're seeing out of the deal in those 2 months that surprises you?
No. We said from the beginning that this wasn't going to be a peace deal. This was going to be a withdrawal deal. That the whole process, the whole notion behind these talks was based on Taliban apologia. This is an apologetic sort of understanding of the Taliban that presents it almost as if it's an innocent bystander to the original 9/11 war.
Even worse, if I can jump in.
Well, now,
in some cases,
worse.
Even worse, because there was an argument made by senior Trump administration officials, including, I think, people who ought to know better, that the Taliban was going to be fighting alongside Americans against al-Qaeda.
Well, that's the new...
That is fantasy.
That's the new thing. When this all started, it started in Taliban apologia that they were almost an innocent bystander. And I was going to get to that now the whole fantasy has grown to they're our counterterrorism ally. And that came from Secretary Pompeo and others who really got out on a limb, I think, historically speaking, for what they were saying the Taliban agreed to do. The agreement, I encourage people to read the agreement. I've linked to it at Vital Interest Newsletter. I try and link to the source documents as much as I can, whether it be in the jihadi world or dealing with China or dealing with any of these different issues. Because I think if you have time, reading the actual text of something is very important as compared to how it's reported.
And this was 4 pages. So.
Yeah, not even 3.5. The way I put it is, if you've leased a car before or purchased kitchen appliances, you signed much more comprehensive paperwork than this deal, right? And this is supposedly an agreement to quote unquote end the Afghan war. Well, read the agreement and you'll realize how shallow it is, and how vacuous it is. And there are no, basically the bottom line is the U.S. put on paper that it was going to withdraw. And let me back up for a second. First of all, folks, I'm certainly critical of the way the Afghan war has been prosecuted. I get a lot of the criticism and I agree with some of it, right? What I would say is that even if all you want in the world is to withdraw American troops, even from Afghanistan, even if that's all you know is that soundbite, right? This deal was not necessary for any of that. You did not have to sign a deal with the Taliban to withdraw American troops at all. It was not necessary. So the whole idea is, if you're going to do a deal with the Taliban, you better get something out of it. There better be some use to it, some utility for doing a deal as opposed to just withdrawing American troops. And there's nothing. There's no utility out of this deal. Negotiations took place entirely on the Taliban's terms. They locked out our Afghan government allies from the talks. They said the Taliban sat down from the beginning and said, we're not going to talk to you and the Afghan government. We're only going to talk to you, because they see the U.S. as the puppeteer and the Afghan government as the puppets. And they knew that they could extract concessions from the U.S. without the Afghan government in the room and undermine the Afghan government's legitimacy. And that's exactly what the Taliban did, while building up their own political legitimacy. And a good example of political legitimacy is that you have Secretary of State Pompeo became the first cabinet level official to ever fly over to Doha or anywhere and meet personally with the Taliban, right? And shake hands with them and say, yeah, you're basically a legitimate negotiating partner. And Pompeo, in the agreement that he and Zalmay Khalilzad, special representative for these talks, signed, to show you how the legitimacy works, the Taliban, this all began under the Obama administration, this effort for these talks. And it was America has always chased, and we don't have time to get into the whole torturous history here, but America has always chased the Taliban for a deal, not the other way around. It should tell you something. But under the Obama administration said, look, we'll talk to you, but you can't refer to yourself as Islamic Emirate of Afghanistan. Why is that? Well, Islamic Emirate of Afghanistan is the totalitarian regime the Taliban had in Afghanistan from 1996 to 2001 that the U.S. overthrew. And if they're referring to themselves as Islamic Emirate of Afghanistan, it means they have no desire for real peace, because it means they just want to reinstall their nasty regime, their authoritarian regime in Afghanistan. And so the Obama administration broke away from talks in part because the Taliban insisted on calling itself the Islamic Emirate of Afghanistan. When the Obama administration allowed the Taliban to open a political office in Doha, the first thing they did was unfurl a banner saying Islamic Emirate of Afghanistan in Doha. And basically the Obama administration policymakers at the time said, used some cuss words to express their disappointment because they realized they'd just been played, right? Well, let's flash forward now to the Trump administration's deal. And you can go to the text of the agreement. And what is all over this deal? Islamic Emirate of Afghanistan. The Taliban refers to itself as Islamic Emirate of Afghanistan all throughout the deal. And the State Department very clumsily, because the State Department was so desperate to have any kind of agreement with the Taliban, clumsily inserted this language that says that Islamic Emirate of Afghanistan, which the U.S. doesn't recognize. Well, yeah. And so all throughout the agreement, I don't know how many times this, few dozen times, this language is inserted in there. And what does that mean? Well, the Taliban didn't give up its dream of resurrecting Islamic Emirate of Afghanistan. The U.S. gave up its demand that the Taliban give it up, and this is one of many concessions that went into this deal, which is a bad deal, which undermined the Afghan government, empowered the Taliban, and the U.S. really got nothing out of it. So
can I ask a quick pointed follow-up on that? You covered the Obama administration's negotiations with the Taliban in great detail. Is the deal at the time, of course, Republicans and conservatives were seeing the terms of the deal as they were reported in the press and saying this would be tantamount to a cave to the Taliban.
Right. And President Obama didn't take that deal.
And President Obama didn't take that deal.
Right.
Is the deal that the Trump administration made worse than the deal that the Obama administration contemplated?
I would say it's tough to say because we didn't have the actual text of the agreement that Obama turned down. But I would say that for all the reasons that deal was deemed weak and deemed unacceptable, this deal is the same thing. It's just as weak, if not more so. Basically, it's at least as weak as what President Obama wanted to do. And it basically comes down to the U.S. Again, I think people should read the text of the agreement because it's very strange the U.S. would get boxed into this sort of way of thinking about Afghanistan. But not only did the U.S. agree to a 14-month timetable for withdrawal, which again wasn't necessary from Afghanistan, the U.S. also agreed, if you look at Section 1, Part F, language that nobody's talked about, nobody's reported on, right? The language says the U.S. will refrain from ever threatening Afghanistan militarily again after the withdrawal. Wow. So we're now going to pretend that there are no counterterrorism threats coming from Afghanistan that we need to worry about or neutralize to protect Americans. It's all now going to be on the Taliban to protect us. Well, that's basically one of the 10 reasons Long War Journal exists is, and this is the website I run with my colleague Bill Rojo, is to document why that thinking is flawed. The Taliban remains deeply in bed with Al-Qaeda to this day. Nothing out of this deal, despite what Secretary of State Pompeo and Special Representative Zalmay Khalilzad have said, despite everything they've said on this and the way they've sold it to the American public, nothing in this deal changed that relationship. There's no break in the relationship. The Taliban hasn't done anything to Al-Qaeda. I doubt very highly they will. And the idea that you're trusting Al-Qaeda's longest ally to now be America's de facto counterterrorism partner seems to me to be a pretty disgraceful way to extricate American forces from Afghanistan.
Sarah, can I jump in with one more question before we, just because I'm obsessing about this the way that Tom is? There's another section of the agreement that hasn't gotten nearly the amount of attention that it ought to have. Near the end, I don't remember the section and the letter. You probably do, Tom. But it leaves open the possibility that the United States will be providing resources to a Taliban-led government in the future, which if you stop and think about that, is absolutely extraordinary. You think about the days, the years really after the 9/11 attacks, when you had the Taliban actively supporting Al-Qaeda, working alongside Al-Qaeda. The leadership of the two groups were intermingled. This has been true ever since those attacks. It was true before those attacks, and
still right this moment as we're speaking.
Still true today.
Right.
And the Bush administration mantra at the time was, "We will not negotiate with terrorists." And now here we are, less than 20 years later, not only negotiating with terrorists,
capitulating,
but strengthening the
Taliban
through those negotiations and leaving open the possibility that we will be funding a government run by those terrorists. I just think people haven't quite gotten their mind around the dramatic change in U.S. policy with respect to the Taliban that this deal sort of locks in.
Yeah, no, the section you're talking about is at the end of what the section that America says what it's going to do. And it says it's willing to basically provide economic support for a new Islamic government in Afghanistan. Well, what's a new Islamic government?
Yeah.
And this is where you have to understand the perverse nature of all this, right? The Taliban has never intimated or indicated that they're willing to do anything other than resurrect the Islamic Emirate of Afghanistan, their own totalitarian regime. They've never said that they're willing to share power with the current Afghan government or form a new government with the current Afghan government. That's all been a fantasy by the peace processors who've been involved in this. The Taliban actually rejects that out of hand. It says we're not going to share power with puppets. So what does a new Islamic government in Afghanistan look like? Well, the only new Islamic government that the Taliban is going to accept is their government. Is their people don't know this or remember this, but you remember with the rise of ISIS, Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi was known as the Emir of the Faithful, right? This is the title that the caliph, this would-be caliph of all Muslims, takes for himself and that his supporters gave him. Well, what is the title that the Taliban's Emir or leader has for himself and that all of his followers, and Al-Qaeda, by the way, refers to him as? It's the Emir of the Faithful. Abatullah Akhundzada, the Emir of the Taliban, is the Emir of the Faithful. Well, guess what? That's not a title that he's going to share power as some sort of delegate or a bureaucrat in an Afghan government or share power. That is the title of someone who actually thinks that he could one day be the Emir of all the faithful, right? And this is how all the jihadis in his orbit refer to him. So this is the idea that they're going to politically compromise on that, which is sort of a Taliban apologia that's baked into the whole process. It's always been a fiction from the American side, and it's a nice little cat behind you there, Sarah. As we're recording this on something I've never used before called Squadcast or something, and there's the video footage where Sarah has a cat. This is now the third appearance of this cat, I think, during the time.
Yes.
So
he really likes the podcast time, by the way. The rest of the time he's napping, but if I'm taping a pod, he's right there.
He has to get up and meow in the mic. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yes,
he's loving on you. He's definitely enjoying himself during the podcast. This is sort of a new thing for him, I guess, to be able to.
You're a cat owner, so you know this, but like if you try to get them to go away, it will make them meow more. So like the best thing you can do is just sort of let them do their thing.
I got a cat for my wife and daughters wanted a cat. So we got a cat for them. And I'm not a cat person, to be honest. And I spend more time feeding the cat and attending to the cat than anybody. So, and the cat also comes in, I'll be asleep at 4:45 in the morning or 5 o'clock in the morning. And all of a sudden I'll hear him meowing as the cat is right next to my head, waking me up for his morning feeding. So I'm a very,
he knows who his buddy is.
I'm a very happy cat owner, as you can tell. So.
Well, I didn't mean to interrupt. Zoo did mean to interrupt.
Listen, the cat's much more
to.
enjoyable than Abatullah Akhundzada and the Emir of the Faithful. That's for sure. So, by the way, here's something for you. The jihadis are obsessed with cats. It all goes back to some sort of mythology about the Prophet Muhammad loving cats. And so I have all these pictures on my hard drive of jihadis holding cats and posing with pictures of cats. In fact, there was this American who went from Florida to go blow himself up in Syria. And his goodbye photo set, which went to his parents, had all these photos of him holding cats because it was all part of a stage thing. It's
even more reason not to like cats, as far as I'm concerned.
Hey. How do you predict a Biden administration would be behaving differently if Biden were to win in the fall? What changes?
It's a good question. I don't know. I think there's a legitimate concern that there'll be some backsliding on China. I don't think the Trump administration has the answers, but I think that Biden has been over his career a lot softer on China. And there's some concern that maybe won't have the realistic outlook of the Chinese Communist Party that we need to get to in terms of where they are. I think when it comes to various other issues in the jihadi world, Biden wanted to have sort of a counterterrorism posture in Afghanistan. He didn't want to do counterinsurgency when that debate was raging during the Obama years. Now, basically, even a counterterrorism posture is going to be out the window if this current so-called withdrawal deal is adhered to. I don't know that he's going to reverse course on that. I don't know that he's going to say, oh, no, we really do need to stay in Afghanistan longer than this deal called for. I don't know that he would do that at this point. I think, basically, I think my general view of the foreign policy world is it's not just that President Trump has a scrambled eggs approach a lot of times to his understanding of stuff. I think the whole field has been upset on over time. There's not really a common. Americans don't have a common shared understanding of the world that we live in, or the threats that we face, or whether or not we should, or let alone how we should face them. You can still see there's still quite a bit of debate about China. And believe me, when it comes to China, for example, I can't think of a quicker way to get a lot of Americans killed than to have some sort of land war in Asia. So this is not something that I'm pining for. Okay, that's the worst case scenario down the road, and we should want to avoid that at all costs. But all costs doesn't mean capitulating the Chinese influence on the world stage or undermining American influence, the Chinese Communist Party undermining American influence. That only will precipitate nastier conflicts down the road if America doesn't hold itself strong. And I think that's basically the big question for me is, what happens here? The bureaucracy in Washington that has shifted this idea of great power competition. It's not well defined, and nor is it understood exactly what that's going to mean in the long run. There are definitely things you can see the Marines doing, definitely things you can see the counterintelligence that ODNI is doing, see things the State Department's doing. But whether or not we can maintain that and build on it and improve it, most importantly, improve it, really remains to be seen. And I don't know that Biden has it in him now to do that, to improve any of that. I think he comes from a school of international relations that is often pretty weak. I mean, I didn't see him piping up about the Taliban talks too often when, basically America started to capitulate in that regard. So I don't really see him as somehow gonna make America stronger in the long run.
And do you think he'll go back to the Obama era Iran relationship?
Well, they want to get into something like the JCPOA or some version of it, with Iran again, certainly. And again, that deal was, a good example of the deal where if America just makes a bunch of concessions, we expect the Iranians to be well behaved. That's sort of the version of diplomacy that the Obamaites and people I would think would be working for Biden come from. And what they'll say about somebody like me, for example, is, "Oh, you don't believe in diplomacy." I said, "No, I strongly believe in diplomacy. We need diplomacy, but we can't have feckless, mindless diplomacy that starts with me walking in the room giving you concessions. That's not the way diplomacy is supposed to work, And that's the way it's funny. We were just talking about the Taliban withdrawal deal. By the way, some of the same people who were laid down the tracks for that withdrawal deal laid down the tracks for the JCPOA, which is the Iran nuclear deal that Trump got out of. And so it's one of the bizarre contradictions in all this. One of the bizarre things you can witness, or a nerd like me witnesses anyway, is that the Trump administration on the one hand is backing out of the Obama administration's deal with Iran, when the same type of thinking and the same type of worldview and even some of the same personnel also laid down the tracks for the Taliban deal that the Trump administration goes full steam ahead on. So it's a really bizarre
suggests that it's less about the threats and more about just withdrawing. Right? That sort of gives the game away.
And a scrambled eggs view of the world, where you can't really put together a consistent picture of what's going on or even what's in the eggs. You don't even really know. It's sort of like the bad hotel version of scrambled eggs. You eye it. You're like, I'm hungry, I need a breakfast, but I'm not really sure what's in these eggs. That's sort of how I look at how people are looking at the foreign policy world right now.
This metaphor is making me hungry, Steve.
I'm ready to go make some eggs, break some eggs and make some eggs. So we're running out of time. I don't want to keep you too long, but I did want to get to, I've got about 50 questions I'd like to ask you about Iran. We'll save those, shelve them, and ask you back at some point soon. Where we haven't talked at all about Russia. Where does Russia fit into this broad threat picture? It feels to me, in part because of the polarized debate that we've seen about Russia domestically here over the past few years, that we're having, to the extent that we're having a debate about Russia and the threat that Russia is, it's a phony debate, because you now have this is reflected in lots of public polling, Republicans have shifted their views on Vladimir Putin and Russia dramatically over the past 5-6 years, where you now have more Republicans with a favorable view of Vladimir Putin than a lot of, I would say.
They've come close to the Dana Rohrabacher view.
They really have.
Which is really bizarre to watch. Dana Rohrabacher is a congressman from California, now retired, who was very apologetic for Putin, suspiciously so for years. I testified for him one of the 20 times I testified for Congress. I testified for one of his subcommittees. He had a bunch of questions, even though the hearing wasn't about Russia. There was a lot of Russia. Very strange worldview, and they're not in the Dana Rohrabacher camp per se, but they've come closer to his view of things for sure,
And so how should we look? How should we look at Russia in the broader threat picture?
Look, I don't think Vladimir Putin's changed at all. If I could change this computer, you could see I got a whole tranche of books on Putin and Russia now, because I've been reading up on that for the newsletter as well, trying to distill that down into things that make sense. A couple of things on that. One, I'm not certain that Russia's a great power. So we've talked a little bit about great power competition, the way Washington looks at it. And great power competition usually means America versus Russia and China, or China and Russia. I think Russia is a power. I don't think it's a great power. It doesn't have the economic might that China does. It doesn't have the sort of ability to influence things and play the soft power game that China does. So I think it's a little bit different, but that doesn't mean I'm downplaying Putin or what Russia's all about. One in particular, because if you can see in the newsletter, I've sort of started to tease this. I'm going to do more on this. You can see that Putin has come to Xi's aid throughout the whole coronavirus pandemic, and you can see this relationship between Russia and China is pretty strong at the moment, and there's a lot to be worried about. The combination of the two then does make a real great power. Beyond that, Russia is often a spoiler. They have a zero-sum game of the view of the world and American power, and basically anything that's bad for America they view as good for them, oftentimes, which is a bad deal, of course, for Americans. Vladimir Putin is not going to back off that. That's who he is. That's who he's been for decades now, and that's how he views the world. I do think he thinks the fall of the Soviet Union was one of the great historical calamities. He's said as much, and I think that's definitely how he views things. And because that means that the Kremlin and Russia lost its influence and its power on the world stage, and he would like to reclaim as much of that as possible. I don't think he will be able to. I think he'll only be able to claim some of it. But you're going to see all sorts of problems arise with Russia going forward. We already see them now in Ukraine. You saw them previously in Georgia. You're going to see, going forward, Russia is going to continue to press its case and try and enlarge the Kremlin sphere of influence through every way they can. And enlarging their sphere of influence means decreasing or depleting America's sphere of influence. And I think that's an important point that I think some Republicans are now missing.
Well, I want to move to a more serious topic, which is, as a foreign policy guy, would you say you're more excited about James Bond as a character or Jack Ryan?
Gotta be honest with you. Pretty much neither, right? I don't know. Like I have a sentimental sort of affection for the James Bond series, there was that rumor was floated at different times that Idris Elba could be the next James Bond. I mean, that'd be fantastic. I don't know.
Yeah, I'm very excited.
I don't know what's holding that up, but the only reason I watched the series Luther on Netflix with my wife was because of, Idris Elba was in it. Otherwise, I couldn't care less about it, but he'd be great. Although I like Daniel Craig. I like the Jack Ryan series sort of, I haven't watched that at all on Netflix. I think that's a show right on Netflix. I watched the first series.
Don't.
Not great.
Yeah.
I like John Krasinski. Yeah. Not great.
They flipped Venezuela, right? I read something where they flipped the socialist regime in Venezuela to being the good guy in the storyline. This is if you want to know what motivates me in vital interest in my writing generally, it's that sort of moral inversion I can't stand. I just cannot stand it. It's like it's the same thing that bothers me when I see somebody say, "Oh, the Taliban's our partner now against terrorism." All right, no, I can't. I can't abide. I can understand the world's
original Tom Clancy, Jack Ryan. I mean,
that's a different thing. That's the Harrison Ford Jack Ryan, I guess. Yeah. I mean, that there's a lot of appeal to that one. For
I'm
sure.
still sort of a sucker for Jason Bourne. I'm not. Action movies are not my thing at all. Really, but
go look at the Wolf Warrior. Go look at the Wolf Warriors action footage.
I've seen that. Actually, there's a good.
And you can see. That'll bring you around. You'll love action movies.
We're like bringing this full circle like professionals would, actually, because we're going back to China and we're talking about Hollywood and we're marrying all this together. There is a very good documentary that the PBS NewsHour has put together. I think basically what they did was they strung together a number of individual pieces about China and the U.S.-China relationship that they've broadcast over the years and made it about an hour and 45-minute documentary. It's very good, I think. And they talk about the Wolf Warrior. They've got some of the footage in it, and the American's the bad guy, and the Wolf Warrior's the hero. Yeah. So,
well, thank you so much for joining us, Tom. We appreciate your newsletter. It's called Vital Interest. Really encourage people to subscribe. And I'm sure we will be talking to you again, because I don't think any of these topics are going away ever. Steve, last thoughts.
Yeah, thanks, Tom. We're happy to have you aboard. We consider Vital Interests vital reading, and look forward to more.
No, thanks for having me. I really appreciate it.
Talk to you guys soon. Thanks for listening.